The train arrived at Millhaven Station 40 minutes late. Nobody waiting on the platform seemed to mind. In Montana Territory and in the autumn of 1878, 40 minutes meant nothing against the scale of the land, against the weight of the mountains that pressed down on every side of the valley like sleeping giants who had not yet decided whether to wake. Time moved differently here. It always had. Eliza Wren minded. She stood in the doorway of the last passenger car and looked out at the platform before she stepped down, the way she had learned to look at a room before entering it, the way every woman learned who had spent years arriving in places where she was not entirely expected. The station was small. Unpainted timber, a single lantern already burning orange in the early dusk, a hand-painted sign that read Millhaven, in letters that had begun to peel at the corners. A dozen men moved through the space with the particular efficiency of people who had things to do before dark. Horses were led, crates were unloaded. Two women in traveling clothes were already being welcomed by men who had driven their wagons in from whatever direction the land went when you left this valley behind. Nobody was looking for her. Eliza stepped down onto the platform with one brown leather valise in her right hand and a canvas bag over her left shoulder. The canvas bag was heavier than the valise. It always was. The valise held her clothes, her winter stockings, the small framed photograph of her mother, and a Pennsylvania hospital certificate in a cardboard sleeve. The canvas bag held her instruments. The bag she would not have left behind for anything. She was 22 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months. And she had traveled from Philadelphia to the edge of the known world because of a single sentence written by a man she had never met in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning when she had already decided she could not stay where she was. The letter from Garrett Calloway had been 10 sentences long. 9 of those sentences described the ranch, the acreage, the work, the winter, the expectations of a woman who would come to this place and build a life from ground that did not give anything without asking for something in return. The sentences were blunt and practical. The handwriting of a man who wrote rarely and meant everything he put down. Eliza had read those 9 sentences and felt nothing she had not expected to feel. Then she read the 10th. She had read it standing at the kitchen table of the boarding house on Spruce Street in Philadelphia, where she had lived for the 14 months since Marcus had died, and when she finished the sentence, she set the letter down and stood very still for a long time. The sentence said, "Last winter, 3 women in this valley died in childbirth. There was no one here who knew what to do. She was on the train inside a week." Now she stood on the platform in the growing dark and watched the last of the other passengers disperse, and she thought about what she had not written in her reply to Garrett Calloway. She had not written that she was a trained midwife with 5 years at Pennsylvania Hospital behind her. She had not written that she had attended 31 births, 17 of them complicated, that she had lost 2 patients and knew with clinical precision why each of them had been lost and what might have saved them. She had not written that the canvas bag contained a complete obstetric kit, that she knew how to read the color of a woman's face in the last hour of labor, that she had once kept a mother alive for 6 hours through a hemorrhage that would have killed her without intervention. She had written that she was willing to work hard and that she did not frighten easily. Both of those things were true. They were simply not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Eliza Wren had not come to Montana Territory to be a wife. She had come because 3 women were dead who might have lived, and because the man who wrote that 10th sentence had not known he was writing an invitation. 20 minutes passed, the platform emptied. The station agent began to lower the lantern over the door. Eliza stood with her valise and her canvas bag and did the mathematics of her situation quietly without drama, the way she did most things. If no one came, she had enough money for one night at whatever passed for a hotel in Millhaven, and in the morning she would ask directions to the Calloway Ranch and arrange transportation. She had arrived in worse positions than this. She had delivered a baby in a railway car outside of Pittsburgh during a storm that stopped the train for 9 hours. She had managed. Then she heard 3 horses coming fast. They came in from the north end of the main road at a pace that said something had delayed them and they were making up the time. 3 riders. 3 horses of different colors in the fading light. And even from a distance, before she could see their faces, something about the way they moved together told her that these 3 had ridden alongside each other for a very long time. The first man swung down from his horse while it was still slowing. He was tall in a way that registered before everything else, the way height does in open country, where there is nothing to measure a man against but sky. Broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle with the particular kind of stillness in his face that comes not from a lack of feeling, but from lifetime of deciding which feelings were worth showing. His hat was dark brown and had been rained on many times. His coat was the color of the mountains to the east. He looked at Eliza the way a man looks at terrain he is about to cross, taking in elevation and distance, in difficulty without judgment, simply gathering information. He said, "Ren, sorry for the time. There was a situation at the ranch. No elaboration, no warmth exactly, but no coldness either. Just a statement offered and then finished." This was Garrett Calloway. She knew it without being told. The second man came down from his horse with less economy and more energy. He was younger, maybe 29, with the same amber-colored eyes as the first, but wearing them differently, wearing everything differently, with a directness that stopped just short of being rude and then decided not to stop after all. He looked at Eliza from her boots to her face and back again, and he said it loud enough for her to hear, "Smaller than I thought, soft hands. Never worked a field in her life." Eliza said, "My hands are not soft." She held up her left hand. In the last light of the station lantern, the calluses along her palm were visible, the small crescent scar at her wrist from a steel clamp that had slipped during a difficult delivery 3 winters ago, the thickened skin at the tips of her first 2 fingers from years of pressure and work, and the particular demands of a job that looked gentle from the outside. "Just no fence wire marks," she said. "Those are different things." The second man stared at her hand. Then something in his face broke open briefly, just a crack, and he laughed. Short and sudden, like it had surprised him. This was Reed Calloway. She was certain of it before he said his name. The third came off his horse the way young men do when they are genuinely glad to be somewhere with an ease that had nothing to perform because it wasn't performing anything. He was 26 or thereabouts with the same foundation of bone and coloring as his brothers, but assembled with a different spirit entirely, a spirit that seemed constitutionally opposed to guardedness. He said, "I am Finn. That one's Reed argues about most things, but he's useful. That one's Garrett doesn't argue, but he's more alarming. Are you hungry? I left cornmeal on the stove." Eliza looked at the three of them standing there in the Montana dusk, 3 men who shared a name and a face structure, and something deeper than either, some quality of knowing exactly where the other two were at all times without having to look. She thought about the letter. She thought about the 10th sentence. She thought about the 3 women who had died last winter in this valley. "I'm ready to go," she said. They rode in the dark for more than 2 hours. Eliza sat behind Garrett Calloway's saddle on a horse that was patient with the extra weight, and the mountains came up on both sides as they descended into the valley, and the stars appeared in a quantity she had never seen from any city window, and she understood for the first time in a cellular way that she was very far from everything she had known. Garrett Calloway spoke enough to give her the shape of things without giving her more than she could hold at once. The Calloway Ranch was 1,200 acres bounded on 2 sides by lower mountain ranges, with the Birch River running north to south through its center. His father had broken the land 20 years ago and was 3 years dead now, taken by a fall from a barn roof during a blizzard that should not have been survivable for a man his age and would not have been. 11 other families farmed in this valley, all of them dependent on the Birch River for water and on the single mountain road into Millhaven for everything else. He paused. Then he said that approximately 3 months ago, the livestock in the valley had begun to die. Not all at once, not in any pattern that followed the usual logic of disease, one by one quietly without the inflammation or the visible sickness that would have told a man what he was fighting. Just cattle that stood still one morning and did not rise the following morning. Horses that stopped drinking and were gone within 2 days. 42 cattle across the valley since July. 15 horses. "Doc Harlan can't explain it," Garrett said. He did not say this as a criticism, he said it as information. "He's old now. His eyes aren't what they were. I'm not putting that on him." Eliza was quiet for a moment, watching the river appear below them in the dark, a moving silver line through the black of the valley floor. "Is there a pattern in where she asked. "By location," Garrett turned his head slightly. She could see the line of his jaw against the stars. "Most of them are near the lower section of the birch." "Why?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I want to take a water sample in the morning." He looked at her for a moment longer, then faced forward again. The ranch house was larger than she had expected. 2 stories of solid timber, a barn that could shelter 20 horses, Storage enough for a serious winter in a kitchen garden on the south side that had been harvested clean and neat before the first frost. Someone had built this place with the intention of it lasting. She could see the intention in every joint and crossbeam, in the way the porch had been set to face the mountain view and catch the morning light. This was a home built by people who planned to stay. She stepped into the kitchen and found a small boy asleep in the chair by the stove. He was perhaps 4 years old. His cheek was pressed against the arm of the chair, his breathing easy and even his hands folded under his face with the boneless grace of sleeping children. He was holding a stuffed rabbit that had once been white and was now the color of old snow worn to softness by a long time of being carried everywhere. Eliza looked at Finn. Finn looked at the floor, then at the wall, then because there was nowhere else to look at her. "That's Oliver," he said. "He's not mine." Garrett said immediately, his voice carrying no heat but absolute precision. "Not Reed's either." "Mine," Finn said quietly. He did not apologize. There was something careful in how he said the words, something that had been said before in his own head many times and was now being said aloud for the first time. "I found him 6 months ago, North Trail Road. His parents' wagon was attacked. Both of them were gone. Nobody claimed him." "Finn hadn't told me," Garrett said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact that contained under its surface something that was not anger, but it was adjacent to it. Something that looked more like hurt, which was its own kind of information about a man who was supposed not to show things. "Because you'd have said to take him to the orphanage in Millhaven," Finn said. Directly, not defiantly, but with the steadiness of someone who had already had this conversation in his head and knew exactly where every line of it led. The kitchen was very quiet. Eliza looked at the sleeping child. Oliver. She looked at the worn rabbit. She looked at the three men arranged in a silence that had history in it, years of history, the particular weight of people who have shared a space long enough that they can fight without raising their voices. "Is he well?" she asked Finn. Finn blinked. It seemed he had been prepared for many responses, and this was not one of them. "He eats well, sleeps well." A pause. "He doesn't laugh. Since I found him, I haven't heard him laugh once." "That's not unusual," Eliza said, "after what he experienced. It doesn't mean he won't recover. It means he needs time." She said it plainly without performing comfort, and she watched Finn's face do something it had apparently needed permission to do. He exhaled slow and long, and some of the tension in his shoulders released. She asked to be shown to her room. The room was on the second floor at the end of the hall. It was small and clean with a window that faced the mountain to the east. There was a bedside table with a water pitcher and a small frame photograph on it that she did not look at directly, though she registered it in the periphery of her vision. A wedding photograph. Two people in formal clothing. The woman looking at the camera with an expression of complete seriousness, the man looking at the woman. 3 years ago, a woman had lived in this room and slept in this bed and looked at that mountain through this window. 3 years ago, she had died, and no one in this valley had been able to stop it from happening. Eliza set her canvas bag on the floor next to the bed, where she could reach it in the dark if she had to. She lay on top of the quilt with her boots still on and looked at the ceiling and thought about four things at once. She thought about 42 cattle dead near the lower Birch River, dying without visible disease over the course of 3 months. She thought about the sleeping boy who had not laughed in 6 months. She thought about the marriage certificate still folded and unsigned in the bottom of her valise. And she thought about a question she was not ready to say aloud to anyone. If the water in that river was carrying something it should not carry, something that had been put there rather than having always been there, then someone had put it there. And someone who would put something into a river would have a reason. And reasons of that scale in a valley, this isolated, pointed towards something larger than bad luck or bad water. She did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, she was in the kitchen before the sun cleared the mountains. When the three Calloway brothers came in from their early rounds, they found the table already set with oatmeal and coffee. They also found Eliza sitting at the head of the table with her notebook open in front of her writing. Reed poured his coffee and looked at the notebook. The notations were in a compact hand, a mix of standard letters and symbols he did not recognize. It was the shorthand of a professional, the private language of someone whose job required recording observations quickly and accurately. "What are you writing in?" he asked. "A list of questions about your livestock losses," she said without looking up. and a list of the families in this valley I need to visit for health assessments. Specifically, any household with pregnant women or young children who drink regularly from the Birch River. Reed set down his cup. You're a midwife, not a detective. A good midwife understands the environment her patients live in. She looked up at him, then direct and calm. If there is a problem with the water source and I don't investigate it, I'm not doing my job. The most important birth I attend might be 3 months from now, but the conditions affecting that birth are happening right now. Reed opened his mouth and then closed it. There was nothing wrong with what she had said. He could find no seam in it. Garrett sat down across from her. He had not said anything yet. He poured his coffee and watched her with the same quality of attention he had given the terrain the night before, taking in what was actually there rather than what he had expected. What do you need first, he said. A water sample from the lower section of the Birch River, and then I need to meet Doc Harlan. I'll take you. Reed looked at his brother. Something passed between them that Eliza did not have enough context to read yet, though she noted it with the same care she noted everything. They went to the river in the late morning, Garrett and Eliza walking the half-mile from the ranch house to the lower bend, where the birch widened and ran slower over flat stones. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful in high country, with a violence underneath the beauty, the cold clarity of the water, and the sharpness of the autumn light, and the silence that was not peaceful but alert. Eliza crouched at the bank and filled a glass jar she had brought from her bag. The water was clear. It ran over her fingers and felt clean. That was the first thing about arsenic that most people did not know. It did not announce itself. It had no color, no smell, no particular taste. At the concentrations that killed slowly, it was patient. It worked over time. She sealed the jar and stood up and turned around and stopped. A group of 4 horses was coming along the lower valley road. The man in front was not from this valley. She knew it the way you know certain things from a collection of details that the eye gathers before the mind names them. His horse was too well kept. His clothes were too pressed. His boots had no mud on them, which meant he had come recently from somewhere with better roads. He was perhaps 50, compact and precise, with the particular confidence of a man who never had to raise his voice because everything around him was already arranged to hear what he said at normal volume. He brought his horse to a stop on the road above them and said, "Calloway." Garrett said nothing in return. He had turned toward the sound of hooves, and he stood with his arms at his sides and his face entirely still. "Douglas Crane," the man said. "Pacific Northern Railroad. I've come with an improved offer." "The answer is the same as the last 2 times you came," Garrett said. Crane's expression did not change. He had anticipated this. "I understand you need time. That's reasonable. I want you to understand that the rail line will pass through this region regardless of your cooperation. The only variable is whether you leave with a good price or with whatever the court decides to give you." He was looking at Garrett when he said it. Then briefly his eyes moved down the bank to Eliza, to her hands, to the glass jar she was holding. The look lasted less than a second, but it was not the look of a man who was curious about what a woman was collecting from a river. It was the look of a man who already knew what a woman might find in that river and was calculating what it meant that she was looking. Eliza's hand tightened around the jar. "Leave my land, Crane," Garrett said. Crane turned his horse with an ease that suggested he was not in any hurry. "Think about it, Calloway. All 12 families, same time. The offer expires at the end of the month." He rode back the way he had come, unhurried, his 3 men following. Garrett watched them go. Eliza watched Crane. She was watching the moment already 100 yards down the road when he half turned in his saddle and looked back toward the riverbank. Not toward Garrett, toward the jar in her hand. A look that was gone before anyone could have said they saw it. But she saw it. She held the jar against her side as they walked back to the ranch, and she did not say what she was thinking because she did not yet have what she needed to say it. She needed Doc Harlan. She needed 2 days. And she needed to be wrong, because if she was right, then the problem in this valley was not a problem at all in the ordinary sense of the word. It was a crime. Doc Harlan's office occupied the front room of a small building on Millhaven's Main Street between the hardware merchant and the post office. The sign outside said physician and surgeon, and below that in smaller letters, by appointment or emergency, which suggested that in 30 years of practice in this territory, he had stopped pretending there was much difference between the two. He was 68 years old with hands that trembled slightly when they were not doing something purposeful, and eyes that were sharper than any other feature suggested they should be watching from behind thick glass lenses with the quality of a man who had seen most of what human bodies were capable of going wrong and had not lost interest. He looked at Eliza with those eyes for a long moment when Garrett introduced her. Then he said, "Where did you train, Pennsylvania Hospital?" "5 years." "How many complicated deliveries?" 17 managed primarily by me." "How many lost?" "2. One placental abruption at full term, no intervention would have changed the outcome. One eclampsia, not enough time from first seizure to delivery, even in a hospital setting, I believe the result would have been the same." Doc Harlan was quiet for a moment. He looked at Garrett, who was standing near the door with his hat in his hands. "Better than me," the old man said. "I've lost 4. He stopped. He did not look away from Garrett when he said the next part, "including Mrs. Calloway." The room held its silence. Garrett said nothing. The muscles along his jaw moved. That was all. Eliza placed the glass jar on Doc Harlan's examination table. "I need you to analyze this," she said. "Birch River water lower section 2 miles east of the Calloway Ranch. I have a hypothesis, but I need evidence before I say it to anyone." The old man picked up the tear and held it to the window light. Clear water, unremarkable in every visible way. "What's your hypothesis?" he said. "I'd rather not say until I see your results. I don't want to influence what you're looking for." He looked at her over his glasses. There was something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to respect. 2 days for basic analysis. That works. On the ride back to the ranch, Garrett said nothing for a long time. The road climbed back through stands of aspen that had gone gold in the October cold, the leaves turning and falling in the light wind that came down from the north, and Eliza rode beside him on the second horse he had brought for her and watched the valley open below them. "You could have told me," he said finally, "about your training." "I could have," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about how to say it accurately. "Because I didn't want you to offer me a position. I wanted you to offer me a place." He considered this. The horses moved. The aspens shook their gold. "There's a difference," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said, "there is." That evening, after Finn had taken Oliver upstairs and Reed had gone to check the horses for the night, Garrett placed the marriage certificate on the kitchen table. It was already half filled. His name in that same compact, purposeful handwriting that had written the 10 sentences. A blank line for hers. He remained standing, which she had already begun to understand was how he did things he found difficult. Standing instead of sitting, moving instead of staying still. "I need to tell you something before you sign," he said. He was looking at the certificate, not at her. "I'm not looking for something romantic. I understand that's what these arrangements sometimes become, and I don't say that to be discouraging, only to be honest. I need a partner. Someone who can help maintain this ranch and serve this community." He paused. "And I needed someone with medical knowledge in this valley because I lost someone important for the lack of it." The last part was very quiet. "Your wife," Eliza said, "and the child." He stopped. 3 years ago." "I know," she said. She had known from the room, from the photograph, from the way Doc Harlan had watched his face when he said it. "I'm not good at most of the things a husband is supposed to be good at," he said. "I work well. I'm fair. Beyond that, I can't promise things I'm not sure I know how to give." Eliza looked at the certificate for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I also have something to say before I sign," she said. "My husband died 8 months after our wedding. I never learned how to share a space with another person in the way that married people are supposed to share space. I make my own decisions. I don't ask permission for things I've already determined to need to be done. I'll listen to your judgment on things you know better than I do. I won't listen to you on things I know better than you do. I don't have the habit of telling other people what to do," he said. "Then we should be fine." She picked up the pen. "But signing this doesn't mean I'll stop investigating the water," she said. "That's my condition." He watched her sign her name. "All right," he said. There was nothing romantic in it, no warmth performed. Two people at a kitchen table in Montana Territory in 1878, making an agreement with their eyes open. And if there was something more than agreement already beginning in the room, something that had nothing to do with the paper or the pen, or the conditions stated plainly in the October lamplight, Neither of them named it. It was too early. It was too fragile. And both of them had learned in their different ways that the things worth having were things you did not rush. Eliza set the pen down. "Good night," she said. She went upstairs and stood at the window of the room that had belonged to a woman she never knew, and looked at the mountain to the east, invisible now in the dark, but present, its weight felt even when its shape could not be seen. Somewhere down the hall, Oliver slept with his worn rabbit. Somewhere below, Garrett Calloway sat at his kitchen table with a piece of paper bearing two signatures and whatever thoughts he did not show the world. Somewhere in Millhaven, Doc Harlan was probably already at his analysis table with the glass jar, because men like that did not wait until morning when there was something worth examining. And somewhere, if she was right, there was something in the water of the Birch River that had not arrived there naturally. Something patient and colorless and devastating. Something that someone had put there on purpose. She would know in 2 days. She turned away from the window and unpacked her canvas bag in the dark, laying each instrument carefully on the small table by the bed, the way she had done in every new place she had ever worked, making a home of what she carried because the place itself had not yet become one. Outside, the October wind came down off the mountains and moved through the valley, and the river ran in the dark below, clear and cold, and giving nothing away. The first 2 weeks at the Callaway Ranch taught Eliza things no letter could have prepared her for. She learned that Montana mornings arrived differently than Pennsylvania mornings, with a cold that was not aggressive but absolute, settling into everything before dawn, with a quiet authority that made you understand why the people who stayed in this country were a particular kind of people. She learned that the Birch River sounded different at different hours, a low-moving sound at midday, something closer to a voice at night when the wind dropped and the valley went still. She learned that Reed Calloway, who had looked at her hands on the first night with the frank assessment of a man evaluating livestock, was also the first one awake every morning, already at the barn, before she came downstairs, and that he left the coffee pot full without being asked. Small things. The vocabulary of a shared space learned one word at a time. Reed taught her to ride. He taught it the way he seemed to do most things, without softening the edges, with direct corrections and no commentary on her difficulty, which she came to understand was his version of patience. When she fell the second time, catching herself on her palms in the cold dirt of the corral, he waited for her to stand before he said anything. When she fell the third time and stood again and got back on the horse without looking at him for permission, something in his expression shifted in a way she had no name for. Yet, a small adjustment, like a door that has been sticking, finally moving smoothly on its hinge. Garrett said nothing about the riding lessons. He simply began leaving the second horse, saddled on mornings when Eliza had families to visit, so that she would not have to ask. She converted the unused storage room off the kitchen into an examination space. It was 8 feet by 10 feet with one north-facing window that gave good light without direct sun. She cleaned it herself over 2 days, scoured the floorboards, whitewashed the walls with lime she found in the storage barn, and arranged her instruments on a shelf she made from boards she found in the woodpile. Garrett built the shelf without being asked, measured and cut, and fitted it while she was out visiting May Sutton, so that when she came back, it was simply there. Reed sourced lumber from somewhere without explanation the following week and constructed a second shelf higher up for her reference books. He said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it either. May Sutton was a woman of 38 who had been managing her farm alone since her husband had died of a lung fever 2 winters ago, and she had 3 children, and she had learned to run an operation that would have challenged 2 men by becoming the kind of person who did not waste energy on anything that was not essential. She welcomed Eliza with the careful warmth of someone who did not give welcome easily, but gave it completely when she chose to. Her youngest, a boy of 7 named Cal, had been complaining of ear pain for more than a year. Doc Harlan had looked at the ear and said children often had ear pain and that it usually resolved on its own. It had not resolved on its own. Eliza examined the ear with her otoscope in the thin autumn light of May's kitchen and saw immediately what Doc Harlan's aging eyes had missed: a chronic infection established over months, the kind that did not resolve without intervention, and that could, if left much longer, cause permanent hearing loss in a child who needed every sense he had to grow up on a working farm. She told May plainly what she saw and what needed to be done. May Sutton listened in the particular silence of a mother who has been worried about something for a long time without being heard. When Eliza finished explaining, the older woman pressed her lips together hard and looked at the wall and breathed twice through her nose. Then she said, "What do you need?" From that day forward, May Sutton became the first person in the valley who trusted Eliza Wren without reservation. In the evenings, Eliza sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and read aloud from her medical texts because she had always thought better by reading aloud, and because the sound of a steady voice was something she knew from experience that frightened children found useful. She read about circulation. She read about bone structure. She explained what the heart did and how it managed it, and why the body was so much more remarkable than it appeared from the outside. Oliver watched all of this from a careful distance. The boy was present in the ranch house, the way a barn cat is present appearing when he chose to retreating, without announcement, always aware of where each person in the household was, without appearing to track them. He ate well and slept well and caused no trouble of any kind. He simply did not speak more than necessary, and he did not laugh. Eliza did not push him. She understood from everything she knew about how children carry trauma that pushing was the one approach guaranteed to fail. She simply existed near him, letting him grow accustomed to her, the way a horse grows accustomed to a new smell, by repeated exposure without threat. By the end of the first week, Oliver had climbed onto the chair beside her and was sitting with his rabbit listening. By the end of the second week, he was pointing at the anatomical drawings in her reference book and looking at her with a question in his eyes that he had not yet found words for. On a Wednesday evening in the third week, she stopped at a diagram of the circulatory system and said without looking up from the page, "Oliver, would you like to hear your own heart?" He looked at her. He nodded once, very small. She took the stethoscope from her bag, fitted the earpieces gently over his ears, and placed the chest piece against his ribs. She held it there and watched his face. He felt his own heartbeat, and his eyes went wide in a way that had nothing of fear in it. His mouth opened slightly, and then slowly moving across his face like the first light of a morning that had been a long time coming, a smile appeared. Small, careful, real. Finn was standing in the kitchen doorway. He turned away before she could see his expression clearly, but she saw his shoulders move just once, the movement of someone swallowing something that had come up unexpectedly. Garrett was sitting near the far end of the kitchen. He did not turn away. He looked at Eliza with an attention she noticed without acknowledging, the way you notice a change in the light without looking directly at the sun. 15 days after Eliza's arrival, Doc Harlan came to the ranch on his mule in the early afternoon, carrying a handwritten sheet of paper folded in his coat pocket. He came into the kitchen, where all four of them, Garrett, Reed, Finn, and Eliza, were finishing the midday meal, and he sat down at the table without being invited because he was the kind of man who had long since passed the point of needing invitation, and he placed the paper on the table face down for a moment, as though he needed another second before he put what was on it into the room. Then he turned it over. He said, "The arsenic content of the water sample from the lower Birch River is 4 times the safe threshold for livestock, 6 times the safe threshold for children and pregnant women." The kitchen was completely silent. "Arsenic does not occur naturally at this concentration in granite-based soil," Eliza said. She had been waiting for this, had known it was coming for 15 days, but the confirmation still settled in her chest with a particular weight. "This comes from an external source." Reed pushed his chair back. "Crane." "We don't have direct evidence yet," Eliza said immediately. "This isn't evidence." Reed pointed at the paper. "This is evidence of arsenic in the water. It is not yet evidence of who introduced it, how, or from where." She looked at him steadily. "If we go to anyone with an accusation against Pacific Northern, before we have direct evidence, Crane will retain lawyers who are better funded than anyone we can access, and we will lose the evidence along with any credibility we have. We have to find the source first." Finn looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Eliza. "Upstream," he said. "Upstream," she said. "When?" "As soon as we can plan it properly." Before they could plan anything, Wade Boone came. The sheriff arrived the morning after Doc Harlan's visit, riding alone his horse at a walk, as though he was not in any hurry and wanted anyone watching to see that. He stopped at the fence line and did not come through the gate, which Eliza had learned meant something about a man's certainty of his welcome. He was broad through the middle and had a mustache that had been blonde once and was going gray now in patches, and he had the eyes of a man who had made a series of small compromises over a long time and had slowly stopped noticing that each one moved him further from where he had started. "Calloway," he said. I've been hearing that someone out here has been taking samples from the river, causing concern in the community about the water. The arsenic content of the lower Birch River is 6 times the safe limit for children, Garrett said. He said it without inflection, the same tone he would have used to describe the weather. Doc Harlan has the results in writing. I'd be glad to send you a copy. Boone's horse shifted. The sheriff's expression shifted with it a small recalibration. I'm not aware of any arsenic problem. Now you are, Garrett said. Eliza stood on the porch steps behind Garrett. She watched Boone's face during this exchange with the careful attention she gave to all faces, the slight pause before he responded, the quality of surprise that was not quite genuine surprise. A man who had heard for the first time about poison in the local water supply would have had a different kind of pause. This pause was the pause of a man encountering information he had hoped might not reach him. I'm just letting you know, Boone said finally with the measured tone of a man choosing each word for its legal weight, that unfounded accusations against large companies can create legal difficulties for the people making the accusations. We haven't accused anyone, Garrett said. We know there is arsenic in our water. That's not an accusation. That's a fact. After Boone rode away, Reed said he knows he is, or he's protecting a business relationship he doesn't fully understand yet, Eliza said. Both of them are possible. We don't know which until we know more. Reed looked at her with an expression that was close to irritation and closer to something else, the expression of a man who is accustomed to seeing situations in primary colors being asked to look at them in gradients and finding reluctantly that the gradients are more accurate. 3 weeks after Eliza arrived on a night when the first serious rain of autumn hit the valley in cold sheets that turned the yard into mud before midnight, she was awakened by a knock that was urgent without quite being frantic, the knock of someone who was frightened, but managing the fright. She was dressed and on the stairs before her mind had fully caught up with her body. May Sutton stood in the open doorway, soaked through her face, carrying the particular pallor that Eliza had learned to recognize as a woman who had been frightened into a kind of terrible calm. Clara Prentice, May said, the farm at the end of the valley. 2 months early, her husband says she's in trouble. Eliza had her bag in her hand before May finished the sentence. Garrett was at the barn by the time she reached the yard. She did not know how he had heard, whether he had been awake already, or whether some instinct had pulled him up. But the horses were ready, and he was ready, and he asked her nothing except which direction she needed to go. They rode 4 miles in rain that made the road difficult and the dark complete. Garrett set the pace and she matched it, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said. The Prentice farm was lit from every window. Abraham Prentice met them at the door. He was a large man, the kind of large that comes from decades of genuine labor, with hands that could probably bend iron, and a face that in this moment was doing something that large, strong men's faces sometimes do under enough pressure. It was simply failing to maintain its usual arrangement. He looked at Eliza with an expression of complete surrender, not to defeat, to trust. He had heard enough about her from May Sutton to open his door to her without question, and that was what he did. He opened the door and stepped aside. What followed was 4 hours. 4 hours of lamplight and insufficient equipment and a woman who had been in labor for 2 days before anyone thought to send for help. 4 hours of a premature child who wanted to come into the world at the wrong angle and had to be carefully, patiently corrected. 4 hours of decisions made in the dark with limited resources and the knowledge always present at the back of Eliza's mind like a pilot light that never went out of what happened when these decisions went wrong. She worked without panic. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford in a delivery room, and she could not afford it here either in this farmhouse kitchen with its smell of wood smoke and rain and the frightened breath of a woman who had been strong for too long already. She worked with the precision that 5 years of training and 17 difficult deliveries had built into her hands, into the way she read the situation through touch and observation, and the small sounds a body makes when it is working towards something it desperately wants to accomplish. And at some point in the early morning, when the rain had softened from its hard assault to a steady gray whisper outside, the child came. Small, smaller than Eliza had hoped. A girl with the scrunched face of all new arrivals, and a cry that was not loud, but was clear and was real. A cry that meant the lungs worked, and the heart worked, and the essential machinery was running. Abraham Prentice was outside the kitchen door. When the sound reached him, he went down onto one knee in the mud of his own yard. He did not make a sound. He simply knelt there in the rain. Eliza came out an hour later after she had made certain that both the mother and the child were stable, after she had left May with instructions and enough supplies for the next 48 hours. She stepped onto the porch in the gray dawn and her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the accumulated effort of 4 hours of work that demanded absolute control throughout. Garrett was standing at the edge of the porch. He had been there all night. She had not known this until this moment, had not known that he had waited the entire 4 hours without coming in, without leaving, simply staying in the space between. He did not ask her how it had gone. He could see how it had gone from her face. He took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders. A practical act. The morning was cold and she was wet from the rain that had blown in through the open door, and she needed the coat. It was not more than that, yeah. But it was also exactly that. No performance, no calculation, just a man who saw what was needed and provided it before she thought to ask. Both well, she said. He nodded. They rode back in the early morning light. The rain gone, now the mountains appearing out of the dark in their full size as the sky lightened from black to deep blue to the particular pale gold that comes just before the sun clears the ridge. Eliza held Garrett's coat around her shoulders and thought about nothing at all. For the first time in weeks, her mind washed empty by the hours behind her and the beauty in front of her, and the particular exhaustion that comes after high effort has resolved in the right direction. She thought she understood riding back through the valley in that light why people stayed in places like this. Not because it was easy, because it was entirely unambiguously real. 1 week after the Prentice birth, when Eliza had confirmed that mother and daughter were both gaining strength and that the household had adjusted to its new arrangement, with the resilient practicality of farming families, she raised the question of the upstream investigation. Reed's objection was not the objection of a man who doubted her. It was the objection of a man who had already thought through the risks. If Crane has men watching the upper river and we go up there to gather evidence, he'll have grounds to move against us legally before we can get the evidence to anyone who can act on it. So we go as hunters, Garrett said. Eliza looked at him. He was looking at Reed, not at her, and he was repeating back an idea that she had offered 3 days ago, offering it now as though it had simply arrived in his mind, which she chose to regard as his version of agreement rather than any lack of acknowledgement. Rifles, hunting gear. If anyone asked, we're tracking elk in the upper valley, Reed said slowly, the resistance in him reconsidering itself against the logic. 4 people, Eliza said. All 3 of you and me. I need to be there to identify the source and collect properly labeled samples. A hunter who doesn't know what arsenic contamination looks like won't know what he's found even if he's standing on it. The 3 brothers exchanged one of their wordless consultations. Finn nodded first easily without deliberation. Reed took longer, but he nodded. Garrett looked at Eliza. We leave at 4 in the morning, he said. They hiked 2 days along the upper Birch, following the river into territory that grew steeper and rockier as the valley narrowed toward the mountains. The work was harder than Eliza had anticipated, the terrain demanding, in ways that her body was not accustomed to, but she had told Garrett she was not afraid of difficulty, and she had meant it, and she kept the pace without asking for adjustments. On the second afternoon, in a narrow tributary, draw off the main river, Finn stopped. He had better eyes than his brothers, or perhaps he was simply looking at the ground differently, the way the youngest child in a family of practical men learns to look for things no one else has thought to name. He crouched beside a section of the stream bank that had been disturbed and restored the stones replaced with a little too much care, the way a human hand restores disturbed ground differently than weather does. Below the surface, fitted under the stream bed and concealed by the restored stones and a mat of cut branches, was a pipe, metal, industrial gauge, running from somewhere upstream through the stream bed and connecting to something they could not yet see. They followed it, carefully moving upstream along the tributary for another half-mile until they reached a flat area screened by a stand of lodgepole pine. In that clearing, arranged with a thoroughness that said this had taken more than 1 day to set up, were 6 large chemical drums connected to the pipe network. Each drum was sealed. Each drum bore a printed label with standardized industrial lettering. Finn read the label on the nearest drum aloud. Pacific Northern Materials Division. Reed stood looking at the drums for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had the flatness of someone who has been angry enough that the anger has passed through heat and come out the other side as something cold and permanent. "They've been poisoning us for months," he said. "They thought if the livestock died, we'd have no choice." "They were right about the livestock," Garrett said. "Wrong about the rest." Eliza was already working. She took samples from each drum from the pipe outlet, where it entered the stream bed from the water downstream of the installation and upstream of it for comparison. She labeled each sample in her compact notation with the date, the location, and the collection conditions. Reed reproduced the layout in a hand-drawn map, distances estimated from the trail markings he had tracked on the way in positions of each drum, recorded with the accuracy of a man who had grown up reading this landscape. They left everything exactly as they found it. On the trail back down, Finn walked beside Eliza for a stretch, while Garrett and Reed moved ahead. "You knew before we came up here," Finn said. "You knew what we'd find." "I strongly suspected," she said. "Is there a difference?" "Always," she said. "Suspecting means you might be wrong. Knowing means you've stopped being careful." Finn was quiet for a while. "Then Reed likes you." "Reed tolerates me," she said. "Same thing for Reed," Finn said. "He hasn't called you that woman in 2 weeks." She laughed, actual laughter, short and genuine. It surprised her when it came out. Finn smiled. She had noticed the kind of smile that arrived quickly and stayed without effort, the smile of someone who had not yet been convinced to stop trusting that good things were possible. She thought about Oliver back at the ranch house. She thought about what it meant that Finn had been carrying that child and that secret for 6 months without telling his brothers, and she began to understand something about the shape of this family that she had not fully seen before. They were not a family that concealed things from cruelty or manipulation. They concealed things from love, from the particular fierce protectiveness of people who had learned that the people they loved could be taken, and who had drawn their circles of protection so tightly that sometimes even the people inside them could not breathe. 2 days after the group returned from the upper valley with the samples secured and Reed's map sealed in an oilskin pouch, Douglas Crane arrived at the ranch again. This time he brought 4 men who were not office staff, and this time the quality of his courtesy had changed the same surface politeness, but something underneath it that had sharpened the courtesy of a man who has decided that patience is no longer his most useful tool. "I understand you've been exploring the upper valley," he said to Garrett. "That area is designated federal land under a pending mineral rights survey. Unauthorized access during a survey period can constitute interference." "We were hunting," Reed said. "Of course." Crane's eyes moved across the group and settled on Eliza with an attention that was different from his previous assessments. More direct, more calculating. "Miss Wren, I've heard excellent things about your work for this community. Pacific Northern holds a high regard for those who contribute to frontier welfare." He paused. The pause was placed precisely. It would be a shame if that contribution were disrupted by involvement in disputes that are really beyond the domestic sphere. Eliza looked at him. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean." "Only that you've arrived recently in that long-standing regional disagreements can be confusing to those who haven't lived with their history. The wisest course is often to focus on one's own area of expertise." "Thank you for the advice," she said. After he left, Finn said, "He threatened you." "He confirmed that he knows I was at the river and that he's concerned about what I found there," Eliza said. "That's more useful than a threat." She looked at Garrett. "We need to get the evidence to the territorial office in Helena before he finds another way to slow us down." That evening, Garrett laid out the timeline. The Helena territorial office was 5 days travel round trip. If they sent someone now and if the investigator they reached had jurisdiction, they could have someone in the valley within 10 to 14 days. But the evidence needed to arrive with the right framing, with the medical documentation alongside the chemical analysis and the map, so that whoever received it understood immediately what they were looking at. "Reed goes," Garrett said. "I should go," Reed said. "Faster on the mountain roads, less recognizable." "Yes," Garrett said. Reed looked at his older brother for a moment. Something passed between them that was not words, the deep understanding of men who have sorted through enough difficult situations together to have a language for the ones where there is no good option, only better ones. Reed left at 4 in the morning. The following 3 days, Eliza worked with Garrett and Finn to prepare the community. Crane had begun visiting the remaining families with increased frequency, and 2 households had received written offers that were notably higher than previous amounts, the kind of increase that made hesitation reasonable. Eliza and May Sutton visited each family in turn, not to argue, not to threaten, but to show the analysis results and explain what they meant in plain language. What 6 times the safe arsenic level meant for a child who drank from that river every day. What it meant for a woman carrying a child. What it had meant almost certainly for the livestock that had been dying since July. The information did what direct argument could not do. It gave people something to hold, something to carry home, and sit with something that was not about loyalty or money, but about their own children's bodies. On the third day without Reed, while Finn was in the barn with Oliver, who had begun following Finn through the daily work with the focused attention of a child who is learning everything he can about everything, Garrett, and Eliza sat on the porch in the last of the afternoon light. She had noticed that he came to the porch in the late afternoon when his hands had nothing necessary to do, which was rare enough that she had come to understand it as a kind of signal, not an invitation exactly, but an opening a space that he left available. She came and sat. They were quiet for a while. The valley moved below them with its autumn colors, in its light, in its river that looked clean from this distance, looked the way it was supposed to look, and would look that way to anyone who did not know what ran beneath its surface. "Are you worried about Rita?" she said. "Always," he said, without any particular emphasis, as though the worry was simply a permanent feature of the landscape. "Since he was 12 and I was 17, Reed moves fast, fast in everything." And Finn, earthbound, differently worried. He was quiet for a moment. Whitwan is quiet about the things that matter most. I should have known about Oliver. He did not say this with accusation. He said it with the weight of a man revising his understanding of himself. I should have made it easier for him to tell me. She looked at him. He didn't tell you because he was afraid you'd make the right decision. Taking Oliver to the orphanage would have been the correct practical response. He knew that. He just knew he couldn't do it. That's not a criticism of him. I know, she said. I think you know it too. The mountains to the east had gone purple in the failing light. Below them, somewhere in the house, Oliver made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood the sound of a child surprised into brief delight by something Finn had done. Both of them heard it. Neither of them said anything. You haven't asked me about Philadelphia, Garrett said after a while. You haven't asked me about my husband, she said. I assumed you'd say it when you wanted to. Same reason I haven't asked. He nodded. The valley went on below them. His name was Marcus, she said. He was a good man. We had 8 months. I don't know what we would have been given more time, only what we were. Garrett said nothing, but the quality of his silence changed the way silence changes when someone who rarely speaks decides to listen with their full attention. I came here because of your letter, she said, the last line. I wondered, he said, why did you write it? He looked at his hands folded together on the porch railing. The hands of a man who had worked this land for 20 years, the land that had taken his wife and given nothing back for taking her. Because it was true, he said, and because I thought if anyone read it and came, they would be coming for the right reason. She looked at him. Were you right, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something more careful than a smile, something that had been held in reserve for so long, it no longer knew quite how to arrive. Yes, he said, I was right. On the 4th night, close to midnight, Eliza woke to a sound outside that was not the wind. She was at the window before she was fully awake, looking out at the yard. The barn door was closed. The horses were quiet. But there was a shape in the yard that resolved as her eyes adjusted into something that had been disturbed and replaced a change in the arrangement of things that should not have been changed. She went downstairs. Garrett was already at the kitchen window, rifle held low, looking out. He did not turn when she came in. He said quietly, Saw it 2 minutes ago. Reed's riding around from the back of the barn. Don't fire first, she said. Her voice was low and steady. If it's Crane's men and they're injured on our property, it gives him grounds to come at us legally before we can move. Whatever happens out there, we cannot be the people who started it. Garrett looked at her. In the low light of the bank stove, his face was shadowed in a way that made it hard to read, but she saw him, hear her. The slight shift of weight, the adjustment of how he was holding the rifle. You think that way fast, he said. It's my job to think clearly when everything is difficult, she said. They waited. Reed came in through the back door 10 minutes later, quiet as a man who has learned to move through darkness. He looked at both of them standing in the unlit kitchen and said, "One of our best horses. The lead rope was cut clean. Not frayed, not broken. Cut." No one had touched the horse. No one had been inside the barn. Just the one rope cut clean, a message without words. The kind of message that says we can reach you anywhere, and we want you to know it. Reed looked at Garrett. "Next time, it won't be a rope." "No," Garrett said. Eliza looked at the two of them, these brothers standing in the dark kitchen of their father's house, and she thought about what Douglas Crane did not understand about this family, which was the same thing people who used money as their primary tool always failed to understand about people who had built something with their hands. You could threaten what a man had. You could not threaten what he was. And these three men were something that had nothing to do with the acreage, or the livestock count, or the dollar value that Crane had put on the land in his ledger. They were people who stayed. Reed returned from Helena on the morning of the fifth day. He came in before sunrise, covered in the dust of hard riding, and sat down at the kitchen table with the particular exhaustion of a man who has expended himself completely and arrived in time. He had reached William Foster, the territorial investigator, a man with the authority to compel cooperation from private companies operating on federal land grants. Foster had reviewed the documentation and the analysis results and the map. He had asked 7 questions, all of them precise and relevant, and Reed had answered all 7 completely. Foster would arrive in the valley in 10 days. The good news came first. The bad news came after Reed had drunk half his coffee. "2 families have sold," he said, "signed while I was gone. Crane moved while we were occupied." Garrett received this the way he received everything, without visible reaction, taking the information in and settling it somewhere inside himself, where he could look at it clearly. "Which 2?" Reed named them. Eliza recognized both names, recognized the faces that went with them, the handshakes, the moments of apparent solidarity in the meetings she and May had held. "He's splitting the valley," Eliza said. She spread the map that Reed had copied from his original. The sold properties sat at 2 points on the western edge of the valley, not adjacent to each other, but positioned so that a line drawn between them would divide the remaining holdouts from the direct road access. If he can add 2 or 3 more, the rest become logistically isolated. It's not about the individual purchases, it's about the geometry. "How many do we need to hold?" Garrett asked. She counted. 7 minimum. We have 8, but the margin is very thin. "Then we need to hold 8, Reed said. "We need Foster to arrive before Crane can move on any more of them," Eliza said. 10 days. 10 days. She looked at the map and at the 2 names and at the 8 that remained, and she thought about all of it, about the arsenic in the water and the cut rope and Crane's precisely positioned courtesy and Boone's careful words, and she understood that what they were doing had moved beyond investigation and into something that required the kind of steadiness that did not depend on winning each individual moment, only on not losing the ones that mattered. Outside, the October wind came down off the mountains. The Birch River ran in the dark below the valley, carrying what it carried, telling what it told to anyone with the knowledge and the patience to read it. 9 days until Foster. 9 days. The valley held its breath. The wait before Foster's arrival was the longest stretch of time Eliza had endured since the weeks after Marcus died, when time had moved with that particular slowness that comes not from emptiness, but from waiting on something you cannot control. Crane did not wait with them. Within 48 hours of Reed's return, the visits to the remaining families intensified. Not threatening visits. Nothing so clumsy as that. Crane sent men with updated written offers printed on Pacific Northern stationery, the numbers higher than before, the language carefully neutral, the implicit message carried not in any single word, but in the sheer persistence of the approach. The way water finds every available crack, not by force, but by patient, continuous presence. Eliza and May Sutton moved through the valley in response, visiting every household that received an offer within 24 hours of the visit. They brought the analysis results. They brought Doc Harlan's written findings. They sat at kitchen tables and spoke plainly to women and men who were tired and worried and whose livestock numbers had been declining for 3 months and who had children to feed through a Montana winter. They did not argue. They did not appeal to loyalty or courage or any of the elevated sentiments that make fine speeches in poor practical guidance. They presented information. What 6 times the safe arsenic level meant for a child's body over months of continuous exposure. What it meant that the contamination tracked precisely with the livestock deaths. What it meant that a company with the resources of Pacific Northern had, rather than making its case openly, chosen to work through a pipe hidden under a streambed in a tributary draw 6 miles from the nearest occupied farm. The information was what it was. They let it do its work. 2 families remained uncertain after these visits. Eliza spent an entire day at one of them, a family called the Morrows. 3 children under the age of 8 and a father whose left leg had been badly set after a break 2 years ago and who walked with a difficulty that told her the bone had healed wrong. She looked at the leg while she was there. She told him what she could do for it with the tools she had and what Doc Harlan could do beyond that and what the family's situation would look like if the leg was not addressed before he was 60. She was not trading medical care for loyalty. She was simply doing her job, which included being present to what was actually in front of her. The Morrows did not sell. On the morning of the 6th day after Reed's return, a man came to the ranch from the North Trail. He was alone, riding a horse that was good but not showy, and he wore the plain clothing of a working man. And when Finn came out of the barn to meet him, he said his name was Cyrus Reed, and he had come a long way, and he needed to speak with whoever was responsible for a child named Oliver. Finn went very still. The man dismounted. He was perhaps 45 medium height, with a steadiness about him that was not the steadiness of a man who was comfortable, but the steadiness of a man who had decided to remain upright through something that had tried to take him down. He had been looking for his son for 6 months. He had the bone-deep exhaustion of that particular search, the kind that could not be slept away because it had not been a matter of rest but of grief moving alongside effort for a very long time. He showed Finn a sketch. It was a child's face, recognizable with the accuracy of a father who had drawn it from memory more times than could be counted. He showed him a silver ring, small, the kind a woman might wear on her smallest finger, worn smooth at the band. Finn looked at the ring for a long time. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has known was coming, without knowing precisely when it would arrive, with a recognition that has nothing of surprise in it and everything of grief. "Come inside," he said. Eliza was in the examination room when Finn brought Cyrus Reed into the kitchen. She heard the voices and came out, and she read the situation from the room's atmosphere before anyone said a word. The way Finn was standing, the way the stranger was standing, the silver ring on the table between them. Garrett came in from outside a moment later, read it the same way. Cyrus Reed explained himself with the economy of a man who had rehearsed this explanation many times and had learned to strip it to its essentials because the emotion underneath it was too large to carry into a stranger's house, along with every word. His wife had died in the attack on the road. He had not been with them that day, had been in town, had come back to find the wagon, and had found nothing else. He had been searching every settlement and ranch and way station within 4 days' ride for 6 months. He was a carpenter. He was from a town to the north called Granger. He was Oliver's father. Finn stood throughout this, with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing that faces do when the person behind them is applying significant force to hold something back, not because the feeling is shameful, but because the room is not the right place for it to come out. "He's upstairs," Finn said. "He's well." Cyrus Reed closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. "I know you've cared for him," the man said. "I know what that means. I know what you've given him." "He didn't laugh for the first 4 months," Finn said. His voice was controlled and accurate, and each word was costing him something. "He laughed for the first time 3 weeks ago." Cyrus Reed looked at him. There was no triumph in the man's face, no satisfaction at having found what he sought, because he understood what he was sitting across from, what it meant to the man across from him that this child had learned to laugh in his house. "I'd like to stay 2 days," Cyrus Reed said, "if you'll have me, so it's not sudden for him, so he has time." Garrett said, "You'll stay as long as Oliver needs." That evening, Cyrus Reed sat with Oliver in the kitchen, while Finn showed the child his father's face in the lamplight. Oliver was quiet for a long time, the way he had been quiet about everything in the beginning, absorbing rather than responding. Then he reached out and touched the man's hand, not holding it, just touching it, the way a child checks whether something is real. Eliza watched from the doorway for a moment, and then went upstairs because this was not a moment that needed an audience. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought about what she was watching and what it meant and whether there was anything to say about it that didn't reduce it to something smaller than it was. A child going home. A man who had stayed, who had given the child 6 months of safety and care and the ability to smile again now, having to give the last thing he had given, which was the child himself. She heard Finn's boots on the porch stairs an hour later. She went to the window and looked out and saw him standing in the yard in the dark, looking at nothing in particular, his hands in his pockets perfectly still in the way that people are still when they are expending enormous effort internally and there is nothing left for the outside. She thought about going down. She decided not to. Some things a person needed to stand through alone and being accompanied through them, however kindly, was not always the same as being helped. She was wrong, she realized later. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough to remember. Because Garrett went out. She saw him from the window crossing the yard in the dark, moving to where Finn stood. He did not say anything that she could see. He simply stood beside his brother, shoulder to shoulder in the dark, not touching, not speaking, just the presence of one person beside another, in the way that siblings who have lost enough together learn to occupy the same silence without it requiring explanation. They stood there for a long time. She watched until she felt like she was taking something that wasn't meant for her, and then she stepped back from the window. In the morning, Cyrus Reed helped Finn with the barn work without being asked. He was good with horses, easy and quiet around them, and Finn showed him the Callaway operation with the careful pride of a man who has built something worth showing. Oliver followed both of them through the barn in the particular way he had begun to move through the world in the past few weeks. Not anxiously, but with the focused attention of a child who is learning everything he can. On the second morning before the sun was fully up, Oliver brought his worn rabbit to Cyrus Reed and put it in the man's hands and then looked at Finn. Finn looked at the rabbit and at the man and at the boy who had been his for 6 months and then was not. He crouched down to Oliver's level. He said, "You keep it. It belongs with you." Oliver looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his arms around Finn's neck with the full commitment of small children, no reservation complete. Finn held on. For a long time he held on. When Cyrus Reed's horse was ready and Oliver was settled in front of the saddle, the boy turned and looked back at the ranch house, at the three brothers standing in the yard, at Eliza beside them. He raised one hand, a small hand with a worn rabbit tucked under its arm. They raised their hands back. The horse moved. The valley road opened ahead of them. The father and son went north, growing smaller against the mountains until the road curved and they were gone. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Reed said, "Coffee's ready." He went inside. Finn looked at the empty road for another moment. Then he followed his brother. Garrett stood beside Eliza in the yard. She could feel the particular quality of his stillness, which she had learned over weeks to distinguish from other kinds of stillness, the held quality of a man who has many things to say and no comfortable way to say them. "He did everything right," Garrett said. "Not about Finn exactly, about all of it." "Yes," she said. "I should have made it easier for him to tell me." She looked at him. "You can make that easier going forward." He looked back at her. Something in his face moved, the slight opening that happened when he decided to receive something rather than deflect it. "Yes," he said, "I can." They went inside. William Foster arrived on the morning of the 10th day after Reed's return from Helena, exactly when he had said he would arrive. He was not what the valley had imagined. He was lean and unremarkable in appearance, with the kind of face that does not announce itself, that could belong to a school teacher or a clerk, or a man who had been making consequential decisions in difficult territories for 20 years without attracting the kind of attention that made those decisions harder. He rode alone. He carried a leather bag of documents. He arrived at the time he had specified, and he shook hands with exactly the firmness required by the situation, and no more. Eliza understood immediately, extraordinarily good at his job. The meeting was held at May Sutton's barn, which was the largest space in the valley, and which May had offered without hesitation when asked. The 8 remaining families came in full, which meant something, which meant that whatever private doubts any of them still carried, they had chosen to be present rather than absent. That was itself a form of statement. Douglas Crane arrived with his lawyer, a man from Billings named Whitmore, who wore a suit that cost more than most families in that room earned in a year, and who carried himself with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to turning up in rooms where the other side was outgunned and leaving before the full extent of the disparity had registered. Crane himself had recalibrated again. The warmth of his early visits was gone entirely now, replaced by something that was still civil, but had the quality of civil that appears when a man who preferred to operate in the background has been forced into a public accounting. He was still controlled, but he was contained in the way that something under pressure is contained not naturally still, but held. Eliza presented the evidence in the order that told the most coherent story. First, the water samples and Doc Harlan's analysis. The old physician read his findings aloud from his written report, his voice unsteady, but his words precise, every measurement stated twice, every conclusion clearly separated from every inference. He was 68 years old and his hands shook, and he read every word as though his reputation of 30 years in this territory, which it was, rested on the accuracy of what he was saying. Second, Reed's map. He had reproduced it on a large sheet of paper and pinned it to the wall of the barn, where everyone in the room could see it, the Birch River traced from its mountain origin to the valley floor. The tributary draw marked the installation site, circled and labeled with the distances that established its location precisely within the Federal Land Survey area. Third, the chemical drums. Not the drums themselves, which remained where they were undisturbed as evidence, but Eliza's detailed written description of each one, including the text of the label that Finn had read aloud in the draw, and that she had recorded immediately afterward in her notebook in full Pacific Northern Materials Division. Lot number, date of manufacture, contents listed in the standardized notation of industrial chemical shipping. Fourth and last, the medical records. Eliza had spent the previous week compiling a document that tracked the health of every child and pregnant woman in the valley against their primary water source and their distance from the lower Birch. The correlation was not proof by itself, but it was a pattern, and patterns read by someone with the training to read them said something that individual data points could not say alone. Crane's lawyer Whitmore mounted his response with the practiced efficiency of a man who had prepared for this scenario specifically. He challenged Eliza's authority to make medical claims without a Montana territorial license. He challenged the chain of custody for the water samples. He suggested the drum labels could have been placed by a third party seeking to implicate Pacific Northern. He noted that federal land use created federal jurisdiction that superseded any territorial investigative authority that Foster might claim to hold. Each objection was stated cleanly and without visible malice, which made it harder to respond to and easier for uncertain people in the room to weigh. William Foster had not spoken yet. He had been listening, which Eliza had understood from the moment she met him was his primary professional skill. He listened the way some people read, absorbing everything and retaining it and organizing it as it came in, so that when he stopped listening and started speaking, he already knew exactly what he was going to say. He said, "Mr. Whitmore, the question of Miss Wren's territorial licensure is noted and irrelevant to this proceeding, as the medical documentation she has compiled corroborates, and is corroborated by analysis conducted by a physician with 30 years of territorial standing. The chain of custody for the samples is documented in writing by two separate parties present in this room. The question of whether Pacific Northern's labels appeared on drums in an unauthorized installation on federal survey land through the action of a third party is an interesting legal theory that I would encourage your client to explore with whatever vigor he finds appropriate in front of a judge who will be examining the full body of evidence I am now authorized to collect." He looked at Crane. "My authority under the Territorial Act of 1873 is not limited by the scope of federal land jurisdiction," Foster continued. "It includes the authority to investigate harm to residents of organized territories regardless of the land classification on which the harm originates. I will be at the installation site identified in this map tomorrow morning. I invite Pacific Northern to send a representative. The presence of counsel is optional." The room was quiet. Then Abraham Prentice stood up. He was a large man, and he stood the way large men stand when they have decided that their size is now in service of something fully without reservation. He said nothing to Foster and nothing to Crane. He looked at the people in the room, the families he had known for years, the families who were tired and frightened and uncertain, and he said, "My daughter is alive. She was born 2 months early on a night when there was nobody in this valley who could have helped her mother, and she is alive and healthy, and she is at home right now because of the woman who is standing in front of you with that documentation." He sat back down. No one spoke after that for a moment. And then one by one, the 8 families in the room made their decision in the only way that mattered, which was by staying in their chairs. Foster spent 3 days in the valley. He walked every mile of the birch from the valley floor to the installation site. He interviewed each family privately and documented what they told him with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the testimony of individuals in a room like this would need to be airtight before it met the legal machinery that Pacific Northern could put in front of it. He examined Doc Harlan's instruments, his records, his 30 years of patient files. He brought his own chemical analysis kit and took independent samples that confirmed what Doc Harlan's results had already established. On the morning of the 4th day, he came to the Callaway Ranch for a final conversation. He sat across from Garrett and Eliza at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his notes, and he told them what his report would recommend. The installation would be ordered removed under federal environmental authority. Pacific Northern's land acquisition activities in the valley would be suspended pending a full investigation into the contamination and its relationship to the company's business interests in the region. The Territorial Attorney General would receive a separate referral regarding potential criminal charges, which Foster was careful to note was a referral and not a determination, and the outcome of that referral was outside his authority to predict or guarantee. He looked at both of them, then at Eliza specifically. "The medical documentation you compiled," he said, "was the most complete and most consequential element of the evidentiary package. Without the correlation between water source exposure and health outcomes in the community, the chemical analysis alone would have been contestable for years. With it, there is a human story attached to the science that is very difficult to make abstract." Eliza said, "It was my job." Foster looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, it was. You should have a territorial license." "I'm working on it," she said. He left that morning. Douglas Crane left the valley 2 days later. He did not come to say goodbye, which was not surprising. His departure was confirmed by May Sutton, who saw his carriage on the main road heading toward Millhaven with the speed of a man who had business elsewhere and reasons to put distance between himself and this particular piece of ground. Wade Boone came to the ranch 3 days after Crane's departure. His badge was still on his coat, but worn differently than it had been a month ago, the way a man wears something he is reconsidering. He sat in the kitchen with Garrett and said that he had not known about the arsenic. He said this plainly without legal protection around it, which was itself a kind of statement. Crane said it was a property dispute, Boone said. "I let him tell me what it was instead of finding out for myself. I've been doing that for long enough that I stopped noticing I was doing it." Garrett said, "You know now." "Yes," Boone said, "I do." He resigned the following week. The territorial office eventually appointed a replacement who was nobody's friend in the way that Boone had been Crane's, which was to say that the replacement had not been given sufficient time in the position to be anyone's friend, yet which was a reasonable start. Pacific Northern found another route for its rail line arcing east, through a pass that added significant mileage and cost, a route that company engineers had dismissed in early surveys as impractical, and that they now found under the circumstances to be entirely workable. The rail line came through that part of Montana 3 years later, not through the valley but visible from its eastern ridge. On clear days, a thread of smoke and iron moving through the landscape at a distance that the valley could observe without being affected by. The winter settled in. It arrived the way Montana winters arrive, not gradually but decisively one morning, when the mountains were a different color than they had been the evening before, and the temperature had moved in a direction it was not going to reverse for months. Eliza had been preparing for it since October, laying in supplies, sealing the gaps in the examination room walls, making sure that every family in the valley had what they needed to get through to March without a medical emergency that required roads that would not be passable. She had by November attended 4 more births, all of them uncomplicated. 2 of the families named their daughters Elizabeth, which she found excessive but touching. Doc Harlan came to the examination room twice a week and sat with her while she worked and told her things about the particular diseases of high-altitude winter living that her Philadelphia training had not covered, and she told him things about recent developments in obstetric technique that his isolation from medical journals had left him without, and the exchange was useful in both directions. The old physician had begun talking about slowing down. Not stopping, he was clear about that, because stopping entirely would mean something he was not ready to name. but reducing, taking fewer cases, letting Eliza carry more of the weight of the Valley's medical needs, while he remained available for the work that still required his particular decades of experience. He said it without ceremony as a practical recalibration, but Eliza understood what it meant and treated it accordingly. She began accompanying him on his remaining house calls, not as his assistant, but as his equal, learning the particular details of families he had known for 20 years, their histories and their tendencies, and the things they would not say directly, but would say sideways if you gave them enough time. Finn became her assistant in the examination room in a way that neither of them had planned and both came to rely on. He had the hands for it, quick and careful, and the temperament patient with frightened people, and unflappable in the face of the unpleasant realities that medical work occasionally required. He learned to prepare the examination room, to maintain the instruments, to sit with a frightened child while Eliza spoke to the parents. He learned it the way he seemed to learn most things, without making much of it, just by doing it repeatedly until it was something he knew how to do. The work gave him somewhere to put his attention. Not a replacement for what had left when Oliver went north with his father. Nothing was that. But a direction, a usefulness, and in the particular way of physical people who process loss through action, it helped. Oliver's absence was present in the way that absences are present when they have been filled with something real. The worn rabbit had gone with him. The small chair by the stove was sometimes empty and sometimes occupied by other children who came with their parents for appointments, and those children did not know that the chair had belonged to anyone in particular, which was as it should be. A letter arrived from Granger in December, postmarked with Cyrus Reed's name in the return address. It contained a short note in a man's careful handwriting describing Oliver's adjustment to home, his return to speaking in full sentences, his interest in the tools in his father's carpentry shop. At the bottom of the page below the man's signature, there was a drawing. It was the drawing of a small hand, and inside the outline of the hand, someone had drawn a rabbit with large ears and a simple smile. Below the rabbit, in the unsteady, oversized letters of a child just learning to write, were two letters, O.R. Finn put the letter in the kitchen, in the place on the windowsill where the most important things went. It stayed there all winter. Reed came to Eliza's examination room on a Wednesday in November with a sealed envelope that he placed on her instrument table without preamble and without explanation, as though the act of placing it there was sufficiently self-explanatory that additional context would be redundant. Inside was a letter from the Montana Territorial Medical Board confirming the registration of Eliza Wren Calloway as a licensed practitioner of midwifery and general nursing within the territory of Montana, effective immediately. She looked at the letter for a moment. She looked at Reed. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Didn't ask to," he said. He picked up his hat from the table and walked out. She heard him cross the kitchen and go out through the back door, and she heard the particular rhythm of a man moving quickly because he does not want to be asked any more questions about something that was straightforwardly obvious to him. She sat with the letter and thought about what it meant, not legally, but in the way that recognition means something when it comes from a source that has not been generous with it. She was here. She was licensed. She was, in whatever way such things were counted in this territory, legitimate. She put the letter in her notebook between 2 pages of patient records, where she would see it every day without having to make anything of it. December arrived, and with it the cold that made the previous month's cold seem like an introduction. The mountains vanished into cloud for days at a time. The valley road became impassable to anything but a single rider moving carefully, which meant that the valley's remaining families became for stretches of weeks entirely self-reliant, in the way that frontier communities had always been self-reliant, and that people who had not lived through it could not fully imagine. Eliza had expected to find this difficult. She had lived her whole life within the reach of a city's resources, its hospitals and pharmacies, and the assumption that if something went wrong badly enough, there was somewhere to go. Here there was no somewhere. There was only this valley and these people and whatever each of them carried in terms of knowledge and skill and the will to apply it when it was needed. She found to her considerable surprise that she did not find it difficult. She found it in a way she had no previous language for, like arriving somewhere she had not known she was headed. Christmas came. The valley celebrated it in the practical way of people who do not have the resources for extravagance, but understand that the observance matters anyway, gathering at the church in Millhaven on the days when the road allowed it, and sharing what they had with the people around them. The Callaway Ranch had more than some of the other families, which was a fact that Garrett had always treated as a responsibility rather than an advantage, and that Eliza came to understand was one of the organizing principles of how he moved through the world. On Christmas Eve, the four of them sat by the stove after dinner. Reed and Finn and Garrett and Eliza in the house held a particular quality of warmth that was not only the fire, the warmth of people who have come through something together and arrived somewhere that feels, if not safe, then at least solid. The kind of ground that holds. Reed told a story about a cattle drive he had been on when he was 21 that involved a river crossing three stubborn steers in a sequence of decisions that had seemed reasonable at each individual step and catastrophic in retrospect. He told it without performance, as a plain account of events which made it considerably funnier than it would have been if he had tried to make it funny. Finn added details that Reed claimed were wrong and that sounded entirely accurate. Garrett said almost nothing, which was how he participated in most things, but the quality of his attention gave the room its center. At some point, the conversation moved into silence that was not an absence of conversation, but a continuation of it by other means. The stove ticked. The wind moved over the roof. Outside, the valley held its winter quiet, the silence of a place that is resting rather than finished. Eliza sat with her notebook in her lap, not writing, just holding it, and she thought about all of it, about where she had been a year ago and where she was now, about the 10th sentence in a letter, and the water jar, and the upstream draw, and the child who had learned to smile, and the girl named Elizabeth Prentice, who was 3 months old and growing well. She thought about the 3 women who had died in this valley last winter, and about what she could and could not do about that, and she thought about the ones who were alive now who might not have been, and she thought about the careful, imprecise accounting that a person makes when they try to understand whether their life is going in the right direction. She thought it was. Garrett was watching her. Not for the first time, not in a way he was hiding, but in the direct, uncomplicated way that he had learned she did not mind, that she had in fact come to find was one of the things she depended on without having decided to depend on it. The awareness of being looked at by someone who was simply and specifically interested in what they saw. She looked back. He said, "You stayed." Not a question, an observation offered as an opening. "I stayed," she said. "Philadelphia doesn't feel like the direction you're going anymore," he said. He said it simply the way he said everything important, stripped of everything unnecessary, just the thing itself. "No," she said, "it doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved. The stove gave its warmth. "When I wrote that letter," he said, "the last part, about the 3 women. Yes. I wrote it because it was the truest thing I knew how to say about what this place needed." He looked at his hands and back at her. "I didn't know it would also be the truest thing I knew how to say about what I needed." Eliza held this. She held it the way you hold something that is both heavier and lighter than you expected, that requires more care than you anticipated, but is also easier to carry than the weight suggested it would be. "I know," she said. "Do you?" "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting to see if you'd get there." Something moved across his face, that careful, near smile, the one that had been held in reserve for so long it had forgotten how to arrive quickly. And then it arrived anyway, slow and real, and she thought it was probably the most honest expression she had seen on any human face in a very long time. "I get there slowly," he said. "I noticed," she said. Reed and Finn had at some point in this exchange found reasons to be elsewhere. The kitchen was empty except for the 2 of them and the fire, and the wind outside and the valley beyond, sleeping under its snow, keeping what it kept. She thought about the letter again, about traveling 4 days to the edge of the known world for a single sentence written by a man who did not know he was writing an invitation, about what it meant that she had come and found not just the place the sentence described, but everything that was not in the sentence, everything that could not have been put into a letter because it required living alongside it to understand. She thought about Marcus, who had been good and gone, and about the 8 months they'd had, and about the particular quality of acceptance that comes when you understand that what was is complete in itself and does not prevent what might yet be. She reached across the small distance between their chairs and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over. He held hers. His palm was warm and calloused and steady, the hand of a man who had worked this land for 20 years and planned to work it for 20 more, and had now quietly and without ceremony adjusted his planning to include a second person in it. They sat like that for a long time in the quiet kitchen while the Montana winter moved over the roof and the valley held its breath and the stove burned down slowly, and neither of them needed to say anything more because the important things had already been said. Not all in words, some in water jars and horseback rides, and 4 hours in a firelit farmhouse kitchen, and a man standing on a porch in the cold because a woman had needed a coat and he had been there. Outside, the Birch River ran in the dark under its ice cleaning, now carrying nothing but what it had always carried before someone decided it could be used for something else. Clear and cold, and in the way that rivers are faithful entirely itself. The valley kept what it kept. The mountains held their place. The stars came out in numbers that Philadelphia had never shown her, and that she had stopped trying to count, because counting was beside the point. Some things were simply there in whatever quantity they were there, and the right response was to look at them and not look away. Spring would come. It always came. The ice on the birch would break, and the water would run loud and brown with snowmelt, and the valley would begin again, the way it began every year, with the patient insistence of ground that knows what it is for. There would be births. She would be there for them. There would be sickness and difficult winters and decisions that had no good answer and only better ones. And she would be there for those too, with her bag and her notebook and the steady hands that had learned their steadiness in rooms far from here, but that belonged now without question to this place. She understood in the quiet kitchen on that Christmas Eve in 1878 exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had arranged it, not because the letter had been destiny in the romantic sense, but because she had made a choice and the choice had been good and the place had been real and the people in it had been worth staying for and she had stayed. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.